Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Tik-A Tee Method, where we are diving into week 4 in this video. My name is Castonguay, longtime educator, composer, author, conductor, clinician, and performer. I'm so glad you're joining us as we dive into flagged eighth notes, eighth rests, syncopation, the importance of downbeats in order to play upbeats accurately, all kinds of great stuff in this video. I hope you'll stick around. Let's go do this. Okay, so here we are in week 4, and as you can see from this page, there is a lot of information here, so we're just going to start at the top and work our way down. At the top of the page, you will notice the appearance of the single eighth note. Back in week 2, all of our eighth notes were paired or grouped together by a single beam. They sounded like this. T, 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 T. That's a full measure of eighth notes in 4/4 time. So how do we recognize an eighth note by itself? Well, let's look at it. Here it is at the top of the page. We have a note head, we have a stem, and now we have the appearance of a single flag. And I say single because later on in the book, we'll learn about double flags and triple flags and so forth and so on. But an eighth note has a single flag off of the stem. If we were to draw an eighth note, we would have our note head, a stem, and a flag out. That's with stems up. If we go stems down, we have our note head, a stem, and the flag comes up. So mathematically, how do flagged eighth notes work? Well, if you have 2 flagged eighth notes right next to each other, they would be equal to 2 beamed eighth notes. Let me show you. Let's say we have 2 beamed eighth notes here. They are equal to 2 flagged eighth notes. They would be the same exact thing. So why use flags instead of beams? Well, if you're within 1 beat in common time and there are 2 eighth notes next to each other, odds are they are going to be beamed together most of the time. Sometimes in choral music, due to text and lyrics and syllables, you'll see flags being used, but for the most part, music will have eighth notes beamed together if they're within 1 beat. So in summation, 2 eighth notes right next to each other, whether beamed or flagged, have the same exact rhythm. They only differ in appearance. But what if we only have 1 eighth note and it's not next to another eighth note? What does that rhythm sound like in common time, and how does that work mathematically? Well, here's where we introduce the eighth rest. The eighth note plus the eighth rest equals 1 beat in common time. And it doesn't matter which one comes first. The eighth rest could come first and then the eighth note. Either way, it's still 1 beat in common time when they're combined. This is where we start to introduce downbeats, upbeats, and syncopation. In this diagram, I'm illustrating what would happen if we took our paired eighth note grouping and removed one of the eighth notes. What would that sound like? What would that rhythm sound like in 4/4 time? Well, let's find out. Let's look at the one on the left here, okay? We've got our grouping of eighth notes paired with a single beam, but I've removed this second eighth note and I've replaced it with an eighth rest. And we just learned that an eighth note plus an eighth rest equals 1 beat in common time. So mathematically, we're still fine. The only thing that we're removing is that second eighth note from our paired eighth note grouping. So normally we have T, 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 T. Well, if we remove the second one from each one of those groupings, we would have T, 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 T. Okay? And this brings us to a very important concept right here, the downbeat concept. A downbeat in music is the pulse of the music. It's where the metronome click is happening, for example. So in 4/4 time, 1, 2, 3, 4, downbeat, 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 downbeat. So when we remove the second eighth note in our paired eighth note grouping, we create eighth notes that all occur on the downbeat. They would sound like this. T, 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 so forth and so on. Now let's look at the illustration on the right-hand side, this one right here. We have our two eighth notes beamed together, our paired grouping. But instead of removing the second eighth note, I'm going to remove the first eighth note and replace that with an eighth rest. And we know that an eighth rest plus an eighth note equals 1 beat in common time. They each get a half a beat, which equals 1 full beat. Now, this introduces a new important concept, the concept of upbeats. We know downbeats are the metronome click or the pulse of the measure. So ta, 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 pulse, 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 pulse. Those are all downbeats. The upbeat is the exact opposite timing of the downbeat. So here's what that would sound like. T, 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 up, 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 up. Okay, that creates syncopation. And if you look down at the bottom of the page, there is a definition here for syncopation. Syncopation is a musical term meaning offbeat or upbeat. So that's the basic definition of syncopation. When you have eighth notes occurring on the upbeat, it creates syncopation in music. And we'll get more into syncopation later in the book, but that's the basic understanding of it beginning with week 4. So if we were to say a measure of upbeat eighth notes, like in the second diagram here, it would sound like this. T, 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 so forth and so on. Very important concept here. So to further demonstrate downbeats and upbeats, we're going to try something. At the bottom of the page, I'm going to draw a measure of eighth notes in 4/4 time. And I'm going to group 4 at a time with a single beam. Label the beats 1, 2, 3, 4. So unaccented, this measure would sound T, 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 T. Pretty easy, pretty simple, right? What if now we accented beats 1, 2, 3, and 4? These are the downbeats in this measure. It would sound like this. T, 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 T. So there is the pulse or the downbeats in that measure. Okay, I'm going to erase those accents and replace them with upbeat accents. So it'll be the second, fourth, sixth, and eighth note in this measure. 2, 4, 6, 8. So now instead of accenting the pulse, I'm going to accent the upbeat, thereby creating some syncopation in the sound. It would sound like this. T, 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 T. So that's kind of a cool sound. And hopefully this further demonstrates downbeats versus upbeats. Now, with all of this, the next step is to go to the exercises and put some of this into practice. Let's go. So, what's the first thing we notice when we turn to the exercises in week 4? We notice these blue and green arrows. The blue down arrows represent downbeats. The green up arrows represent upbeats, and I've included them on the first line of the first 2 exercises just to help give a better visual representation of where downbeats and upbeats are happening in each of those measures. Feel free to draw in your own down arrows and up arrows for the rest of the measures and the rest of the exercises in this chapter to help you build your foundation of better understanding downbeats and upbeats. I've also included all of the Tik-A Tee verbiage for the first 2 exercises to help you continue to connect the words to the rhythms in this method. Feel free in any of these exercises to write in the words if it's helpful to you. So here we are, about ready to perform exercise 4A. Now would be a great time for you to pause the video, take 10, 20, 30 seconds to study the exercise using the techniques I described in week 3's video. These techniques will help you best prepare for that first attempt at sight reading these exercises. Last week, for example, one of the things that I did was add in all the numbered beats for each measure, so I knew where the click was happening and I knew where the beats were landing in each measure. This week, since we're focusing on flagged eighth notes eighth rests, downbeats, upbeats, syncopation. I'm going to continue with my blue and green arrows for the second line of this exercise. So I want to know where all the downbeats are versus the upbeats, and we're going to learn something when we finish this. So let's go. So I'm going to take my blue marker, starting on measure 5 in the second line. I'm just going to write down arrows for all the downbeats, and this eighth note is a downbeat. It's an eighth note, then an eighth rest, creating one beat in 4/4 time, but that creates a downbeat. This is beat 3, this is beat 4, another downbeat eighth note. Going to the next measure, beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4. 1, again, eighth note, eighth rest combination. Downbeat, downbeat, beat 4. Last measure, ta, ta, ti, ti, both downbeats. So what are we learning as we're going through this with our down arrows? We're learning that this is an exercise in downbeats. Let's see how many upbeats we have. Change my marker to green. Going through the measure, I'm looking at measure 6 now, and I see one upbeat here on beat 2, the end of 2, so that second eighth note is an upbeat. On the third beat, our third 16th note would be the upbeat, and I'll get into that later when we talk more about subdivisions of 16th notes, but just know that the third 16th note is actually an upbeat in 4/4 time. Moving on to measure 7, I've got these two eighth notes. The second one, again, is the upbeat, and then as I just described, the third 16th note is the upbeat. We're not going to accent these upbeats in any way, but it's good to know where they are. So again, this exercise is an exercise in downbeats, and now we are ready to perform it together. So first, you're going to get the tempo. We're doing 70 beats per minute, or the quarter note equals 70. I'm using tonal energy again, and I'm still using that drum jam 808 sound that I liked from the last week, but I've changed the visual over to a stomping foot, and I've added eighth notes as the subdivision. Because we're working on downbeats and upbeats this week, it makes a lot of sense to start to hear those downbeats and upbeats by way of the eighth note. So here is your metronome. Then I'm going to give you the pitch. I'm doing this on G3. You're welcome to sing unison with me, harmony, or a different octave. So there's your note. I'm going to count it off. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, 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 ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti, ti, Tik-A, Tik-A, ta, ti, 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 Tik-A, Tik-A, ti, ta, ta, ti, ti. So I hope you did that along with me. Now we go to the MP3s and check for our accuracy. All right, so here we are. We are about to check our accuracy on the exercise we just performed, exercise 4A. We've got that up on the screen now. Lower left of your screen is my computer screen. I'm on my home page where all of the free MP3s are. Again, they are free. Whether or not you buy the book, I'll put a link on this video so that you can access those more easily. I'm going to scroll down now to week 4. Exercise A, and you have one of 3 options, as I've mentioned. You can just listen and follow along and check for your accuracy. You can sing along while I perform it on the MP3, or you can break out your instrument and perform exercise 4A along with the MP3. So without further ado, here is exercise 4A. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, 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 ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ti, ti, Tik-A, Tik-A, ta, ti, 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 Tik-A, Tik-A, ti. Ta, ta, ti, ti. And there you have it. And as I've said in the previous weeks, if you got that exercise right, if you're feeling really confident, the next step, if you haven't done so already, is to perform it on your instrument. And you are about to watch me perform this exercise on my soprano sax. I had a little bit of fun using Logic and some of the loops in Logic. I found a loop that was at 68 on the metronome. So just having a little bit of fun to emphasize the downbeats. I played along on this one with a groove. So check it out. Here it is. One, 2, 3, 4. And now we are ready to tackle exercise 4B. And just like with 4A, now might be a good time for you to pause the video, take those 10, 20, 30 seconds to study the exercise before proceeding. I'm going to move forward with our blue down arrows and our up green arrows to represent our downbeats and our upbeats in this exercise. So let's dive into that right now with measure 5. I've got my blue marker pulled up. My first quarter note is indeed a downbeat. However, the second thing I see in this measure, B2, starts with an eighth rest and then an eighth note. That is syncopation, and we'll get into that with our green marker in a moment. Moving to the next quarter note on beat 3, that is a downbeat. But again, we've got an eighth rest, then an eighth note, which creates syncopation. We'll get that with the green marker in a moment. Measure 6, downbeat, downbeat. Downbeat in the group of sixteenths, downbeat on this quarter note, okay? The next measure, this whole measure, you can see that it's an eighth rest, then an eighth note for every single one of those beats. If I was, for example, to write in the downbeats, I would draw an arrow down on these eighth rests. And I'll just leave those in there for now so you can see where those downbeats lie. We'll talk about the green arrows in a moment. In the last measure, beats 1 and 2 are downbeats. And then beats 3 and 4 both have an eighth rest followed by an eighth note that will create that syncopation we just mentioned. But if I was to draw in those downbeats, they would go over the eighth rest, okay? So we're going to switch over to the green marker now and write in our upbeats. So going back to measure 5, all right, we have this beat 2 thing here where we talked about the eighth rest and the eighth note. When you have the eighth rest first and then the eighth note, it creates an upbeat. So we're going to draw an arrow up on this eighth note. And we're going to do the same thing for the last eighth note in that measure. Okay? If we're to continue writing the upbeats in the next measure, this second eighth note would be an upbeat, and then we talked about the third 16th note being an upbeat in the last exercise. Okay, measure 7. This is a measure full of eighth note syncopation. So we have this one on the end of 1, the end of 2, the end of 3, and the end of 4. So we're going to have a measure full of syncopated eighth notes. In the last measure, we have 2 downbeats on 1 and 2, and then on beat 3, we have a syncopated eighth note on the end of 3, and then a syncopated eighth note on the end of 4. We've got 2 upbeats there. Now, before we perform this, there is a really important concept we need to discuss first. Here is one of the many pro tips in my book, but this one is from week 4, and it's really important for us to grasp this concept before performing this exercise and to help us better understand how to perform upbeats accurately. So this pro tip is talking about strengthening your downbeats to improve your upbeats. And I'm just going to read this, so just follow along with me. The first step to strengthening your ability to play steady and solid upbeats is to recognize and perform steady and solid downbeats in any time signature. The next step is to recognize the upbeats, also known as syncopation. When it comes to the accurate and consistent performance of upbeats, the most crucial element is having a solid downbeat. If you were to try and play multiple consecutive measures of upbeats, for example, syncopated eighth notes like we had in measure 7 from our exercise 4B, without any downbeat being given to you, it would be very challenging to keep the tempo steady and maintain those upbeats for an extended period of time. However, if you needed to play multiple consecutive measures of upbeats with solid downbeats being given along the way, either internally, by a metronome, or by another instrument in the ensemble, you would have a much easier time feeling that syncopation of those upbeats all throughout the passage. So strong downbeats equals strong and accurate upbeats. Musicians naturally accent upbeats or syncopated phrases, and this often helps in the performance and stylistic accuracy inherent with syncopated music. And here in my explanation in the diagram below, you'll notice that I refer to the numeric system for reading rhythms, and that's fine, but just remember that we say T and we say T, right, for the downbeat and for the upbeat. So we're not going to be using numbers, we'll be using T as our verbiage. And now we're ready to perform exercise 4B together. You'll get the metronome, then the pitch, then the count off. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, ta, 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 T, 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 ta, ta, T, T, ta, T, ta, T, ta, T, T, Tik-A, Tik-A, ta, T, 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 ta, ta, T, T. And I hope that you joined along with me. Let's go check for our accuracy. Here we are with the exercise on the page. Exercise 4B is right there. In the lower left, you've got my computer screen with the MP3s. I will again leave a link to these MP3s for you to make it a little bit easier to access. And I am going to press play on 4B. You've got one of 3 options. Follow along and check for your accuracy, sing along, or play your instrument along. So here is exercise 4B's MP3. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, 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 ta. T, 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 ta, ta. T, T, ta, T, ta, T, ta, T, T, Tik-A, Tik-A, ta, T, 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 ta, ta, T, T. And there you have it. So, you know what to do next. If you haven't performed this on your instrument yet, now is the time. And you are going to get to see me do this exercise on soprano sax again. I use the same groove in Logic, had a little bit of fun with exercise 4B as well. Here it is, check it out. One, 2, 3, 4. And that does it for week 4 of the Tik-A Tee Method. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you had some fun, and I hope you learned a little bit along the way too about flagged eighth notes, eighth rests, downbeats, upbeats, syncopation, how to best perform upbeats accurately. I hope you perform those 2 exercises with me as well. Please do check out my book, Rhythmic Sight-Reading, The Tik-A Tee Method. It is available at my website, roncastonguay.com. It is also available at Amazon and J.W. Pepper. In the meantime, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell so you get the latest videos. Until next time, May the rhythm be with you.